Welcome everybody today to one of our NERPS webinars. I'm Dr. Catherine Alfredo. I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Florida and a NERPS research fellow. I'm formerly a cross-appointed faculty fellow here with NERPS. I'm very pleased today to introduce Dr. Somya Joshi. Dr. Somya Joshi is the research director and chairs the AI task force at Stockholm Environment Institute. She's an associate professor at Stockholm University in technology and governance. Dr. Joshi's research has been situated between cognitive sciences and technology design, particularly in how data and systems translate into transparency and accountability in governance. She has over 15 years of experience bridging science and policy for sustainable development and challenging entrenched narratives. If you want to see Dr. Joshi's complete abstract, please, go to the NERPS webinar, but I don't want to take up any time because I'm so excited to hear this presentation. So in this lecture, Dr. Joshi will present a proposed framework and lens via which policy coherence can be achieved and the development of AI can be treated as a global common. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope you all can hear me. I'll start sharing the slides now. Great. So hopefully you can all see that. So hi everyone, I'm Somya Joshi and I'm very excited to be here in Hiroshima as part of the NERPS specially appointed professorships. I work at Stockholm Environment Institute, and today I will be talking about global governance of AI and making a case for planetary health. Very briefly, since I have about approximately half an hour to cover this talk, I'll give a historical overview of what sort of socio-technical paradigms cover when we talk about AI. How did we get there? The materiality of AI, so the implications for the peace and sustainability nexus, and from there go into the sort of global governance landscape of AI, charting out a proposal for a framework and discussing the risks and opportunities that underlie that. So very quickly, what are the three paradigms of socio-technical development? When we look back historically in terms of how we got to where we are today with artificial intelligence, there are three different transformations we're talking about. A transformation of materials, a transformation of energy, and a transformation of information. When you talk about materials, this is the first industrial revolution. Going down, we look at other socio-technical revolutions such as the agricultural, and all the way, if you fast forward to today, we're talking about a transformation of information. Like all socio-technical revolutions, if we look at artificial intelligence, there is an invisibility of data, infrastructure, ecosystems, and labor. What you see in this image here was one of the first textile mills that was presented as an automation of a manual process of creating the loom. Back then too, the assumption was that automation would immediately bring progress and prosperity for people. But what we saw historically is that it took many years, hundreds of years, for those hard-won rights to be trickled down to the population working there. And with artificial intelligence, we face similar dilemmas of this assumption that it will automatically lead to any kind of prosperity for all. I will talk about the materiality of AI. And what I mean by that is there's often an idea that AI lives in the cloud. It's an ethereal concept, but it comes with a very non-trivial footprint when it's energy, water, critical minerals, or labor. And this is at the heart of the nexus of sustainability and peace, especially when we talk about resource limits and frontier communities. I will again bring your attention to the cartography of AI, to the AI Atlas work done by many scholars that actually tease out the details of what a supply chain underpinning artificial intelligence is about. Zooming in, if we just look at one aspect, to be able to have generative AI, computer vision, predictive AI, you need data centers that are built on stacks of GPUs, which are then built via silicon wafers. And all this hardware has, as I mentioned, a very significant material footprint in terms of what goes into the mechanism of delivering an AI service to you. Several scholars have actually done these projections, crunched the numbers, and you look at factors of magnitude of growing energy footprint from AI, electricity consumption. If we just look at from where we are today, this is the IEA report, the latest one, it is thought to almost double by 2030. And if you look in the top right-hand corner, even you break it down into what kind of AI use are we talking about? Are we talking about text or video? You see a significant increase in the energy consumption. Similarly, a recent study by De Vries et al. Talks about the scale of power demand of AI hardware just growing to rival that of small nation states like Ireland, like Switzerland and Austria. So the current, if you see at the baseline, power demand from just AI hardware and data centers is already factors of magnitude the same as energy demand from nation states. And it's not just energy, it's also water. Global water consumption for data is set to almost double and triple by 2030. And this water footprint of AI is not just in the cooling of the data servers, but also in the production of the GPUs themselves. This becomes a source of tension when you look at where projected data centers globally are being positioned in areas of water scarcity. The impacts are felt locally like droughts. And we will come to how this then sits at the nexus of sustainability and peace when we're talking about impacts that are felt very locally, but the demand of it is global. And the final element of the materiality is critical minerals. We spoke earlier about how GPUs are made. If you think about lithium mining, such as the one that's being done in Atacama in Chile, you see that what we're talking about are unequal geographies. The distributive effects of mining in places like the Congo or in South America in the case of lithium, or critical minerals and rare earth minerals in China, all these have severe impacts on local populations. And the demand is being fueled from a global demand that is growing. So why do I raise this point of direct and indirect impacts? Because when we talk about direct impacts, we are talking about things within the life cycle of a product. But here I want to draw your attention to something more systemic, and that is how the impacts of artificial intelligence and technologies can be felt on more behavioral and systemic levels. And what I mean by this is how AI is fueling consumption, so increasing the demand for many things, and also this sort of rebound effect that we're seeing, where on the one hand, there is rising efficiency. So people argue about how AI is instrumental in optimizing our grid, or how AI could help us be more efficient in manufacturing processes. But with those increasing efficiencies also come the factors of magnitude increasing consumption. And this sort of is called the classic Jevons paradox, which we're seeing out with the AI development. Now, if we turn our attention to what we mean by planetary health and peace in this context. Now, as you know, this is a transdisciplinary field that looks at analyzing and addressing the impacts of human disruption to Earth's natural systems, as well as human health, and looking at it specifically from the lens of how are these interventions, but when we're talking about artificial intelligence, impacting our understanding of what it means to be prepared, what it means to have security within one sort of national, subnational, and multinational contexts. In this particular project that I will be researching here, I'm looking at a framework. This one in particular is a framework that was just published in The Lancet, which looks at planetary health. And again, you see that the underlying drivers are very similar to the ones that I presented earlier with regard to AI, which talk about consumption, technologies, how they impact population and demographic change. And then all the way down there, you see impacts on infrastructure, socioeconomic factors, governance, wealth. And it's very important to tease out that relationship between what we're seeing at one end in terms of technological disruption, and on the other, what impacts this has for, let's say, ecosystem or planetary health, as well as peace and security. I won't go into too much detail, but within environmental science, we talk about this period, historic period, as the Great Acceleration, with a very sharp increase in material extraction, but also exposure of different populations to risk. And as from the planetary boundaries literature, as you might know, from the 9 planetary boundaries assessed, 6 have already been crossed as of the 2023 study. So this kind of provides for you, thank you. This provides for you a sort of context against which AI development is taking place. It's not happening in a vacuum. So we are crossing planetary boundaries, and AI has a non-trivial impact on that. So where is the paradox in the age of AI? AI-driven industrial optimization may prioritize economic gains over ecological safeguards. So all the materiality discussion we had before is exactly linked to that point of how we have the narrative or the rhetoric of industrial optimization driving AI development, on the one hand, at the expense of ecological safeguards. With the rebound effects and increase in consumption, we're talking about a negative impact on the planetary resources that are being extracted at alarmingly high rates, as we saw with energy, water, and critical minerals. Against this backdrop, what is the current response of global governance? So you see a lot of multilateral action taking place, some primary examples of which being the OECD, the GPAI, the Global Partnership for AI, where Japan was had the presidency in 2023, the EU AI Act, and several UN-based initiatives looking at creating a platform, a global governance platform, to really mitigate some of these risks that we just spoke about. One particular one of these examples I wanted to bring to your attention was that of the Hiroshima process, which in 2023, the G7 actors, the sort of leaders, met in Hiroshima, and they came up with this process, which is looking at global governance of AI, looking specifically at how to mitigate some of these risks, and for AI development to actually be safeguarded from the lens of sustainability and peace. Like most multilateral actions, there's some challenges as well as opportunities, and I'll just list a few of them to really look at what we're facing as a global governance challenge. So there is an extremely fragmented landscape at present, with several actors doing their own thing with little coherence. There's polarization and weakening multilateralism in this context, and this is further exacerbated by AI's misinformation deluge, where there is a sort of pushback when it comes to action on climate, when it comes to action on responsible AI. Geopolitical shifts in terms of the wars that are currently disrupting global supply chains, not just mentioning the supply chains that underpin AI itself. Resource frontiers, which are sort of shrinking in light of climate and planetary crisis. And the speed of change. What do I mean by the speed of change? Is that the rate at which the technology itself is changing and developing is not the same pace at which governance happens. So governance, whether it's at the national or multinational level, is struggling to keep pace. And often when legislations are passed, or like when we have the EU AI Act as an example, when it's enforced, the technology has already changed and you need to sort of adapt to it. So this is also a classic lag we're seeing. On the other hand, in terms of opportunities, we have a momentum. And as some of the examples I gave earlier in terms of leadership, we're seeing actors from very unusual places come up and say, we are taking leadership, whether that's from the BRICS, whether that's from the Global South. There is a shakeup of traditional trade and supply chain dependencies. So given the current landscape, we're seeing a call for sovereign AI, which is talking about bringing on board the capacity and the ability to develop these systems. And of course, there is the million-dollar question about policy coherence and reform. So given, if you take the UN as a whole system, what should reform look like? Can AI be instrumental in bringing about some element of policy coherence and reform via some of the AI tools that are being developed? This is something we're looking into. The framework that I want to propose is based on Earth alignment and planetary guardrails. So there's a lot of lessons we can learn from climate governance, which can be actually applied today to the global governance of AI. And this has to do with the concept we use within climate governance, which is called transboundary risk, looking at how things that happen in certain geographies impact across national borders. And AI presents a very interesting case there, where you're seeing the sort of concentration of compute data and the ability to yield some of the sort of gains of AI sitting in 5 corporations and certain geographies in the global north, whereas where these resources come from and where the impacts are felt are in other parts of the world. So this is what we mean by transboundary risk. There are some low-hanging fruits that can be used, for example, model size, design and architecture, to really align accuracy of AI models to its environmental footprint. But then there are some long-standing things that need to be done on governance and policy levers to de-risk investments in responsible AI. And here I will mention the global commons approach, which is a concept we use in environmental governance. It's not new. It's a very old concept that was championed by Elinor Ostrom, who spoke about how do we govern what she called common pool resources. These could be as the ecological ones that I mentioned, like water, energy, critical minerals, but it could also mean data. It could also mean the knowledge of the global commons, and how can we safeguard this with a planetary health perspective. To do this, we need to challenge certain assumptions that automation brings about progress automatically without really safeguarding our resources. But also, if we look at supply chains from like semiconductors to chips, from supercomputation to data farms, there are transboundary risks that we are sort of turning a blind eye to at the moment in this sort of rush to get there first in terms of AI development. And how can we bake equity as a design feature in such systems? How can we talk about how AI today is exacerbating inequality around the world in terms of not just how it's being designed, but how it's being sort of unleashed geographically? I have a few discussion questions, but I'm also very open to questions that will come up through the online or participants who are here. But I'd like you to think a little bit about this sort of concentration that we see today globally of compute, data, hardware, and how this is exacerbating inequalities in terms of how could global governance interventions address this. And in the rush for AI dominance, when we look at, for example, misinformation impacts or economic incentives today, weakening multilateral action, how could we sort of counteract that with ownership from frontline communities? Can AI be instrumental as a mechanism in sharpening policy coherence and effectiveness? These are some of the questions I'd like to leave you with. And with that, I stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation and this introduction to a topic that I think we hear about, but maybe don't think about it in the way that you presented it. Before I open it up to people in the room, I want to start off with a couple of questions. And then if you are joining us from online, if you have a question, please post it in the chat and we will ask it out loud for you. You mentioned in the beginning of your presentation this idea about the invisibility of the data systems. And I'm wondering how that is playing into the impact of long-term acceptance, equitability, and sustainability in this field.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And I think the first aspect of invisibility comes with the lack of data or really credible data that we have today from corporations being released on the actual energy and water or life cycle assessment from AI. Until recently, it's been the best guess estimate of scholars trying to extrapolate from what they can find. But this creates an invisibility of what actually is under the hood of AI. Many people's interaction with AI is going to ChatGPT or seeing it pop up as embedded in all the other social media platforms they use. But it's really not so visible on what is the sort of extractive impact it has, not just on ecologies, but people. Another example of this is ghost labor. So currently the training data that underpins much of AI models is being done manually by people in the global south at below minimum wages. And there's been some, in recent times, excellent exposés of that. But for the large part, this remains invisible. And we then accept this technological revolution like we have in the past, thinking that this will automatically create progress and prosperity for all.
Given our history with, I would say, a society, with our lack of wanting to give up comforts for the planet, think about automobiles, driving more efficient cars. As AI has snuck onto almost all of our devices and all of our search engines, how do we expect, or how do you propose the informing of the public catches up to this technology? I know governance is lagging behind, but even information about what this is and what it's doing is lagging. So how do you propose closing kind of like that loop or that gap?
Exactly. And there, I think we have a lot of lessons to learn from the climate area, because the same arguments were used when we talked about multilateral climate action. That is this an elitist concept? Can everyone afford to think or contribute to climate when there are more basic needs upfront? And the sort of classic counter argument to that is it actually costs more to not address this. And it's the same with AI, that it's not to be framed as something we give up or that it's a narrative of scarcity, but that you're working towards abundance, planetary, and also security if you invest in these areas and you don't go blindfolded into it.
Does anyone in the audience have a question that they would like to ask at this point?
Thank you, Dr. Somya. Maybe my question is somehow a follow-up from what was discussed so far. And I was just wondering, like, what type of lessons from let's say, the climate governance we can learn to address this AI issue? Because it's kind of a repetition of the same story about the resources coming from one side and then going to the other side, but then the impacts are on. So what would be, I will not say hope, but what would be the way forward to address this in a, let's say, innovative way or in a more practical way, since we have so many experience and data that the dynamics are that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. And that's exactly the sort of extractive narrative that I wanted to present that this is not new. We've been here before in many contexts, whether it was industrial times with colonization to now we have this narrative of technology innovation, but it's repeating the same extractive narrative. Now, what could be a sort of vector of hope here? And there, some of the most hopeful examples I find from research and multilateral action today is when we look at frontier communities. So these are communities that are either directly impacted by resource extraction or are sitting in those geographies when they become owners of that resource. So one example of this is renewable energy. So when we talk about green transitions or renewable energy, whether it's, for example, solar or wind, we've seen some very promising examples of local communities owning the wind farms and becoming sort of stewards or guardians of the energy that is then produced via these. And safeguarding not just the area, but managing that green transition in a way that it's not repeating that extractive dynamic of taking the resources from one place, whereas the rewards are felt somewhere else. So I would like to imagine that with artificial intelligence, if we break down the components, if similar ownership models can be explored by the communities that are at most at risk, or at least be part of that sort of global governance initiative, that might mitigate some of these risks of repeating that dynamic again.
To build on that, so I think like in the extraction example, I'm like, I could get there, I could follow you. But when I think about like these data centers and stuff being built and it's being green lighted by people at higher levels of government and being put in and then extracting we can see that, in areas of Texas that experience blackouts routinely have huge data centers now on these grids. And it's like, why? Or areas like you pointed out that are water scars are getting these data centers and you're like, why? But it's all above board and they've been, approved with permits and stuff to build there. So, and people in those neighborhoods don't own the electricity, don't necessarily, water rights are a different issue, but, don't always own the access to the water. So how do we get to that ownership model or example in these cases where we have these resources like electricity and water?
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly where the sort of global commons lens comes in, because recently we saw articles in the New York Times about taps running dry in areas where the data centers are being located. And that sort of begs the question, where are these decisions being taken? If governments are being informed by corporations who have a one-point program, which is to expand, and there is a scaling law in artificial intelligence, like the more data you throw at something, the more power you throw at something, the better your models are going to be, which is, again, a contested narrative. The global commons framework challenges that way of decision-making, that you can take those decisions away from the communities that are impacted. So water, energy, critical minerals, in some cases, even the actual knowledge and data that is the sort of building block of some of these training models need to have to be treated as common pool resources. They're not to be treated as privatized or bought resources because the impacts are being felt elsewhere. So the global commons lens, to give you an example, in policy has been used to manage complex areas such as fisheries, global fisheries. It's been used to tackle deforestation. And again, one can argue that the communities that are being impacted by deforestation don't own the forests. They happen to live there. And so it's the same understanding of how we treat these global common resources and how we then manage and govern them.
We'll go Josh and then we'll come up here. We'll go from the back to the front.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It's really interesting and really important work. I just wanted to follow up on your last point and ask the question of, given the urgency on one hand of this challenge and this, this field, given the sort of rush to pioneer and rush to dominate, and given the stakes at play both resource-wise and capital-wise and power-wise, power in the political sense, is something like Ostrom's ideas around polycentric governance actually practically possible in this sort of environment? And if so, what does institutional diversity look like in this space? I'm with you that the common pool resource approach is really a really useful framework. I'm just, over the last weeks and months and years, been grappling with what does polycentric governance look like in this space? Is it possible, or are we moving into more of an oligarchical model?
No, that's a very good observation. And if one was to read what's happening in the world just recently, it doesn't leave much room for hope for a model like Ostrom's. The reason I offer that as a sort of counter, or a sort of almost like an opposition to the current model, is because it's a very interesting time to live in, where entrenched trade and supply chain sort of patterns are breaking down, for good or worse. And it's a moment where we're able to pull some levers which we couldn't even a few years ago, just based on the sort of dependencies of trade. Today, you're seeing open source AI models come out of China, and you're seeing leadership being taken on renewables and green transition from places you wouldn't have imagined. And this opens a certain door of, could we be designing this differently? While if we put polycentric governance on one hand, on one end of the spectrum, and on the other, we put the kind of current practice where 5 corporations, most of them sitting in the US, are calling the shots on something that's going to impact or have huge impacts for communities around the globe, there's got to be middle ground somewhere there. And so it's about really understanding, maybe could we design or innovate new systems of governance to meet these challenges and this new landscape? Thank you.
That's okay. I think you can get it. Thank you very much for your presentation. That's really
Sorry about that. Thanks again for your presentation. That's really fascinating and important. Speaking of thinking of different ways to think about the systems and global governance systems and all of that as a way of addressing the issue, I was wondering if there's a scope in your research where you actually, for a moment, perhaps pause about how we think about development, because much of the development that we, at least based on with respect to how AI is being utilized and being justified, it's very Western capitalistic centric in the sense that, here's how we measure development, here's what development means. But perhaps is it possible that instead of developing new mechanisms for governance mechanisms in order to tackle AI issues, is it possible that we take a step back and reassess how we actually define development, conceptualize development, and try to approach and pursue development apart from, the very linear Western-centric idea of what development is, especially if you look at it from a very decolonized perspective. What's wrong with defining development in terms of eating 3 times a day? In Spanish communities, you have this buen vivir, living the good life, right? But because of how we think of development is having cars, having, these comforts of life, as Catherine mentioned a while ago, then, where we are. So I was just wondering if there's a scope in your work where you actually rethink, what development is, question what development should be moving forward. Thank you.
No, exactly. And I think that's a very good point. And there is a book by Darren Acemoglu, who recently got the Nobel Prize, which is Power and Progress, where I think he teases out some of these ideas of what we think of when we say progress, or, automation will lead to development, and then whose development, and what is that also entrenching certain extractive practices. So there are some scholars globally who I am very influenced by, who sort of come at it from a very different perspective. And these could be indigenous scholars who think of time differently and who think of progress differently. But right now, I think it's also like, how can these voices inform the development of AI, which is very left to those kind of, again, narrow elite group of 5 corporations that are taking the decisions.
Just a practical, I think we discussed that before, but a practical question. I'm not sure if it's governance related, but in terms of tracing the footprint or the life cycle assessment, how would we circumvent the data availability, since you just mentioned about these 5 corporations? So on a practical and then also in a governance sense, how can we go about the data for the life cycle assessment and material footprint?
Yes. So just a few days ago, Anthropic, I think, published the first life cycle assessment of their AI model. And this was hailed as one of the first attempts to sort of give that comprehensive picture of footprint by any corporation today. I think both, like in the case of the political example I gave and in the technology, it comes with pressure from below. So in less than 5 years ago, when scholars were asking corporations for the data, the answer was no, that this data could never be made available. And today, yet we're seeing first attempts at this, comprehensive life cycle assessment. So I think similar pressure, if it can be built from below, from the community, whether it's to the tech corporations or to this sort of governance model coming from the industry, informing a few nations, is yielding some cracks that we can then take advantage of to understand better what is the real impact. And when it comes to the missing data, again, I'm seeing some promising initiatives now. There is one which is looking specifically at AI in the African continent. So it's looking at both the data, what models are being developed, what large language models for the continent are being developed, and also environmental data of centers that are being located there. So I think these kind of initiatives are a promising start, at least in that direction of covering that data drought.
Do you happen to know if Anthropic's life cycle assessment was a positive image of their product, or did it give a more sobering analysis of the impact?
I know for a fact that there are definitely some gaps in there, especially related to energy, that it doesn't look at all. But I would see it as a sort of first step in that direction. So once it was made public, scholars across the world got to work on that life cycle assessment to really break down the numbers and see. And then a second iteration will hopefully cover some of those gaps. The sobering data is actually coming from the IEA reports, the International Energy Agency, but also from the scholars who work with water and critical minerals to show exactly what we're talking about, the scale of this. And that is directly at odds with the narrative from the corporations that say this is nothing to worry about and AI will solve that problem. Yes.
Dalia? Yes.
Thank you, Joshi Sensei, for your presentation. I'm really glad that you're able to also connect with what you've shared with us at our weekly seminar. One point of reflection and maybe one question. I really like this first and third questions because it reminds me of this question about governing the climate. Before, we were really talking about how we can govern climate change and climate action, but now there's also this conversation of maybe we have to start with climate first and then see how can our governance change because of the climate issues. So I think there might be some kind of similar trajectory when it comes to global governance of AI and other digital technologies. So that's my reflection about these questions. And then my question is, You've shown the planetary boundaries. I'm really interested in the Anthropocene and international peace and security in the Anthropocene. And of course, it started as very biochemistry, natural sciences, and then it kind of spilled to political and historical inquiries. And even with the planetary boundaries, there's now even an insertion of the justice component. And when you add that component, it even becomes restricted the boundaries. So I think kind of related probably to the question of development as well. And it's somehow in your presentation, but could you elaborate a little bit whether there's a discourse in the scholarship about the inclusion of justice in this global governance of AI? I know it's already mentioned a little bit, but I'd like to hear more about it. Thank you.
Thank you. We looked at justice quite deeply in the context of just transitions when we talked about green transitions. There is a lot of the planetary boundary work has informed that. In the context of AI, less so. There's less scholarship in that area. One of the reasons I mentioned it here was to highlight this kind of dual process going on. So when we have challenge or us over exceeding planetary boundaries, this is like, if you think of it like a sustainability deficit, and this is impacting peace and security. But the other way around also, when we have, for example, geopolitical shifts, we have wars, and they impact or they disrupt global supply chains, which again creates this sort of narrative of scarcity. So it's like a two-way flow, which really is something, at least in this project, I would like to go deeper into and understand, because as you rightly point out, the planetary boundaries work has so far kind of been removed from that or disconnected, whereas we cannot look at it in isolation. And we're seeing more and more examples of this creep up now in the literature, looking at sustainability and security, or sustainability in the context of what they call preparedness in terms of planetary crises. So AI sits in the middle of that because it offers both opportunities but very serious risks to both the security side and the sustainability side.
Thank you, Professor, for your insightful presentation. I have one question. Before I have read it, and it has been written that like AI is so harmful for environment. Using AI is so harmful for environment because of that kind of significant water consumption. So even in your presentation, I have seen that you spotted put on that slide that for cooling down the system and data and those areas. So my question is, what kind of governance, and because it's already opposite of climate action, environmental protect. So what kind of governance we have to do or is undergoing in your project, in your research for those issues to elaborate that? Can you share with me? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think one very good example of specifically looking at water is a recent cap that has been introduced in the EU. So the EU AI Governance Act is talking about introducing a cap. A cap is like a cutoff level. So over a certain threshold, water cannot be used by these data centers in certain geography. So this is one example of how legislation could be enforced to prioritize the security and sustainability of local communities over what is the demand from the data centers itself for water.
Thank you very much.
If there are no more questions in the room or online, I would like to thank you, Dr. Joshi, for this great presentation and discussion. I know in my own work, looking at water issues, it's so easy to get negative and depressed. And I'm hearing this and I'm like, oh my God, we've gone backwards. We're like 100 years ago and we're back to polluting everything. But your optimism and positive outlook on this is very inspirational, and I'm really excited to see where your research goes, because I think that's so needed in this, because it's so easy to just get down and doom and gloom when we think about these issues, but to think about it as a hopeful way or an opportunity to change how governance works is just such an enlightening way to think about it. So thank you very much.